Right. Okay. So our discussion today is about the themes of Panchatantra. And let me take this opportunity to project my screen and make my points through a document. Can you see my screen now? Is it visible?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Right.
Sir.
Thank you. Okay. So the dominant narrative or the dominant theme of the Panchatantra is, of course, the Niti. And you need to understand also that because we are reading only a segment of the Panchatantra, we'll have two sets of discussions here. One is which deals with the broader text of Panchatantra, the complete text of Panchatantra, as it were, and its associated themes. And we'll also look at a micro level narrative of Kakulukium and the themes associated with this particular book. So we have a macro set of themes and a micro set of themes. Within the macro set of themes, I think the most important theme would be Niti. And what exactly is this Niti? The Niti would involve the carrying out of duties and obligations, familial and socio-political, right? At a broader level, Panchatantra is about Raj Niti, the Niti of the king. But it also involves the Niti of the counselor, the Niti of the soldier, the Niti of the common man. Therefore, it involves this question of duties, obligations, and the exercise of practical wisdom in affairs private and public. Once again, Niti will be associated with, very importantly, practical behavior. And therefore, this question of morality and Niti, whether they are the same or they are different. Ahimsa might be a moral principle, but the Niti, behavior in practical life, might not always be the same principle. So what is the right course of action is what in practical life is what the Panchatantra is talking about. And this wisdom and this quality of wisdom you have to understand is not that of the sage or the saint, but the wisdom that has to govern the thinking and conduct of persons who are of the world and who are in the world. Right? So it's very important to understand that Panchatantra, one of the words will come in Panchatantra, is not about the attainment of moksha or liberation. The Panchatantra is about existing in society, in harmony with society, and existing most comfortably and generously in society. That is the theme of the Panchatantra. So, who are of the world and who are in the world. So, this Niti or this wisdom is a worldly wisdom, as it were. Niti would entail resolute action taken after careful scrutiny and due deliberation. Right. So, Niti involves, I would say, two major components. One is judgment, and the other is resolute action. Right. So one depends on intelligence and the other depends on physical and moral ability. A discriminating judgment has to be brought to bear on all issues, problems, and situations. Now come down to a micro level. What is the Niti of cloud? And what is the Niti of foe crusher? Right. Therefore, judgment has to be exercised, and thereafter resolute action has to be taken. You will remember Livestrong saying that once you have taken judgment, you cannot wait. You must strike very hard. Similarly, foe crusher also says or suggests that once the enemy is in disarray, one must act fast. Right. So stark distinctions of black and white Right and wrong, good and evil can seldom be made in the sphere of human actions. Now, that is where, you see, your classmates' problems start. Now, whether this is moral or immoral is not the question of Panchatantra. The question is whether it is the right course of action in terms of survival. And you'll remember that not everybody will have the same niti. For example, and this will come later on, Cloudy and Livestrong set fire to the neighbor's house or the enemy's house. Now that is Raj Niti, the Niti of the king for survival in the face of great violence and conflict. Now this might not be the Niti of the ordinary man who has to go to the law and to the king first. So you have to understand that Niti is person specific, Niti is occasion specific. Therefore, there is no one single moral parameter in Panchatantra. It depends on the circumstances. Right. And there's this question of whether this is only about monarchs. No, it is not. It is also about practical conduct in life in ordinary circumstances. For example, you'll remember the story of the carpenter who is fooled by his wife, right? The Brahmin who waits for his chance to catch his cheating wife and punish him and her and her lover. So there are stories which mainly deal with kingship and correct behavior of kings, but equally there are stories which deal with the common people. So in a certain sense, the Panchatantra is democratic in the sense that it allows space for ordinary people to exist and talks about their right course of action as well. Now, for me, the main theme of the Panchatantra is self-fashioning, the correct fashioning of the self. Now, what do I mean by self-fashioning? Self-fashioning would involve, undertaking a process of education, which, of course, Vishnu Sharma provides to the princes. The awakening of judgment. We'll shortly come to this question of buddhi. And once again, the expression of the self in action. So fashioning involves, one, the preparation of the self, the gradual modeling of the self, and the exercise of that education within particular situations. And therefore, you have within the preamble itself the concept of buddhi prabodhanam, which is the awakening of the intellect. Right. Now, you will find that when we discussed in the micro level narrative of Kakulukiyam, who is a good king, Livestrong makes this point that valor alone or bravery alone does not make a good king. So folly is to be avoided, right? Foolish bravery is to be avoided. The greatest weapon in the Panchatantra that a man can have is always intellect. So in a sense, there is a prioritization of intelligence and buddhi over physical strength, right? So in many ways, if you think of the concepts rather than the castes, then the Panchatantra is a wedding or a welding of the Brahmin and the Kshatriya, right? In the way that intelligence and action, in this case, warfare, is carried on together. So buddhi prabodhanam is what the Panchatantra talks about in terms of self-fashioning. Prabuddha, with the intellect fully awakened, and avavod dhanarthanam, with the purpose of awakening the intellect. Right? So it includes everything and signifies the whole intellective process. Vishnu Sharma's objective is not providing formal instruction. Now, there's also this question of pedagogy, which we'll come to in a moment. But how does one intellect arouse the intellect? Is it through rote learning? No. Books do not provide knowledge. It is life, experience, and circumstances which, according to Vishnu Sharma, provide knowledge. Right. Therefore, this concept of buddhi prabodhanam is the central concept of the Panchatantra, awakening and fashioning the self into intelligence and correct action. Right. Of course, in Kakulukyon, the other theme that is talked about is the theme of the ideal king. Right. Who is the ideal king? And as you can see from the last segment, the ideal king is one who will combine valor, who will combine the welfare of the people, and who will take the advice of good counselors and follow intellect. For the ideal king, once again, the protection of his disciples is, or let me not use the word disciples, of his subjects is the primary aim. And for that, he can take recourse to deception as well. Now, in the beginning, of course, you have the ideal king Amara Shakti, a warrior, a scholar. So the true king is both the warrior and the scholar. The scholar in the sense that he's well versed and expert in all the branches of polity and economics. But let me point out that the Panchatantra does not talk about the individual king. The Panchatantra talks about the government, the king as government. And this is where the king has counselors and soldiers, generals, right? So we have, of course, not talked about generals in this case, but the king has both counselors and generals. And this entire body of the Raja, Mantri, and the Senapati together form the body of the government. And therefore, one of the major themes of the Panchatantra is which is the ideal form of government, where the king takes advice from the right counselors and where the Senapati and the soldiers provide extreme loyalty to the king. But having said that, let me point out that it is the responsibility of the king alone to execute the decision. He is the government, as it were, when it comes to action, right? He has to take the decision and he has to execute it, right? He can take the advice of counselors, but the responsibility of the action lies with the king alone. Therefore, the theme of kingship and the ideal king is one which is, welded into the Panchatantra, right? And you can see that the theme of the ideal king is something that we find both in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata as well, because these are epics that talk about, once again, the people and the theme of bravery and intelligence. Once again, very important is also the theme of pedagogy, right? How does one teach, right? And this is a theme that is, slightly missed within our broader themes, is how does one instruct? And Vishnu Sharma, of course, makes this point that instruction is not through mere learning of grammar. So one can devote 12 years to studying grammar and to studying of the disciplines, but knowledge and wisdom does not come from mere rote learning. So learning has to combine a lot of pleasure, right? Of the pleasure of the narrative. Have you ever thought about this? That what is the pleasure of narrative? The pleasure of narrative is to identify our own situations in the tales, is to wait for the suspense of the choices that the characters make, and There is humor. There is a lot of pathos also in the story of the dove, for example, right? So pleasure is welded into the concept of instruction. And Vishnu Sharma seems to suggest that it is real life situations and teaching by example that provide the best methodology of learning. So pedagogy, the art of teaching, is an important theme of the Panchatantra. Now, if you come very technically, then within the gamut of Sanskrit literature and thought, Panchatantra is about the Purusharthas: Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. Right. But let us point out that the Panchatantra makes it very clear that it is not about impracticable ideas. In fact, moksha is not the theme of the Panchatantra. There's only one story in the entire Panchatantra which talks about moksha, or freedom from life. And that is the story of the self-sacrificing dove, which we have read, which is once again a one-off, as it were, told entirely in verse. It talks about sacrifice rather than survival. The Panchatantra is about survival. It is not about sacrifice and withdrawal from life. It is about engagement with life, right? So not an impracticable manual for men and women. It is a practical manual for survival. Secondly, it is also about the three ideas of dharma, artha, and kama. So the Panchatantra acknowledges that human society is made up of the desire for money. So I'll not come to dharma first. I will come to artha. And the Panchatantra suggests that poverty is not a desirable state. So, renunciation is not the theme of Panchatantra. The gathering of wealth is a valid human exercise, and the Panchatantra believes that this is a process which has to be encouraged. And the other thing that the Panchatantra suggests is, having earned, a part of it should be generously given. So generosity is a theme of the Panchatantra, no doubt, but generosity is not generosity does not subsume the pursuit of wealth. Panchatantra is a critique of human avarice, but Panchatantra actually encourages the pursuit of wealth and generosity, right? It does not, encourage the hoarding of wealth or the individual sort of possession of wealth alone, right? It also talks about the place of desire in human life and karma. But the theme of the Panchatantra is, of course, sticking to social norms. So the Panchatantra is extremely critical of betrayal in marriage, for example. That is something which is prohibited and to be punished. But the Panchatantra acknowledges that there is human desire, there are transgressions caused by human desire, and that, one must acknowledge the fulfillment of bodily, physical desire within the world. But there is another theme, the theme of moderation in desire, that this desire must not run wild. It must be within social norms. There is, I am arguing, and this is a word which is new to you, there is a normative structure of the Panchatantra, a normative structure, a code of behavior, which is acceptable by the law and which is acceptable by society. So adultery is a code which is I'm sorry, adultery is an action which is against the normative code and therefore to be punished. Avarice, you can pursue wealth, but you should not be all consumed by greed. So avarice is non-normative and therefore to be criticized. The pursuit of wealth is normative, to be encouraged with generosity, right? So these are certain value systems, as it were, the purusharthas that the Panchatantra talks about. And let me now come to this question of dharma, right? Dharma is, in a certain sense, in the Panchatantra, quite relative, although there are certain absolute dharmas that are followed. What is the absolute dharma of the king? To protect his subjects, right? For this, he can indulge, as you have found out, in duplicitous warfare. He can engage spies. He can encourage lies and misinformation. So there are concepts of the dharma that are both absolute and relative. The absolute dharma of the king, welfare of his subjects, and the survival and peace of the kingdom. For that, he can use any dharma of warfare. So in that sense, it is both absolute and relative. And it is also relative in the sense that it depends upon the individual's place in society. Therefore, what is the dharma of the king? Duplicity, violence, might not be the dharma of the ordinary human individual, right? So, for example, it is the dharma of the king and warrior to fight and shed blood. If a ruler is confronted by naked aggression, is too weak and has scant resources, the law recommends that he may resort to underhand means, right? So that is what Cloudy does. But a private individual is not expected to rush out and burn his neighbor's home and family to avenge some wrongdoing, since he does not have recourse to the law. Since he does have recourse to the law, right? So that is how the concept of dharma is both, I would say, absolute and relative. There are certain absolutes in the dharma, and there are certain relatives within the dharma, which depends on the individual's place in society. What is the other great theme of Panchatantra? And this is something which we have not studied adequately because we did only one book. And this is the theme of friendship, right? The Panchatantra acknowledges not only the individual, but also the society, right? Panchatantra believes that the individual can exist only within the social hierarchy, within the social fabric. And therefore, friendship is one of the most important, cherished values to be practiced. And therefore, without friendship, there is no good life. And you see how many texts of the Panchatantra talk about either the gaining of friends, or the loss of friends, or the loss of friends due to foolish action, right? Therefore, one of the major themes of the Panchatantra is true friendship, and true friends, as you see, are the ways through which one learns and corrects oneself. So friendship is a crucial ingredient in the process of self-fashioning. The final theme of the general Panchatantra is living and survival, right? Survival is the primary theme of the Panchatantra. One has to survive, and also one has to practice a good life, right? To be free from fear and want. That is what the principle of good life is. Remember, this is not moksha, to be free from everything, but to be free from fear and, to be free and material well-being is the theme of the Panchatantra, for which what are the ingredients? Intelligence, labor, friendship, kindness, and compassion. This is the wisdom which is, and this is the major theme of the Panchatantra. What is a good life? A good life is one in which there is peace. There's no fear for survival, right? So peace. The second is a reasonable fulfillment of the wants, the comfort, physical, actual comfort, prosperity. Third is friendship. A true life is a good life, one where you can share with friends and family. Fourth, the concept of kindness and generosity and sensitivity to the people who need it. These are the principles of good living that the Panchatantra sets forth, a noble way of living which man can aspire to. Right. So these are the themes of the Panchatantra. Of course, as I point out, the running theme of moksha is not present in Panchatantra. The Panchatantra is about living in society. The Panchatantra is about existence in normative family and social life. The Panchatantra does not seek freedom from life itself or freedom from society, or it does not preach any great liberation of the soul. The Panchatantra, in that certain sense, is a limited text in that it does not deal with the metaphysical, it deals with the social. It's an extremely social text. These are the broader themes of the Panchatantra. Now, if we turn to Kakulukiyam once again, Kakulukiyam is, of course, the first theme that you talk about is once again survival and peace. How does one exist in peace? Can one exist in peace with the enemy? So the second theme of Kakulukiyam, along with peace, is enmity, right? It's not friendship in this case, it's enmity. How does one deal with enemies? And you see the tale of the Brahmin and the snake, which produced a golden coin. The snake suggests that once you have generated an enemy, it will continue. There's no healing of enmity. For example, the crows and the owls, how the owls became the enemies of the crow. The crow realizes that false speech can produce enmity, but once enmity is produced, it is almost a running feud. It cannot end. Therefore, how does one deal with enemies? Does one make peace? Does one fly away? And the theme is that once there is enmity, it has to be eradicated. So the Panchatantra in that sense is a ruthless text also. It talks about a ruthless eradication of enmities and a non-healing of enmity. So enmity is a state which has to be weeded out, which has to be completely destroyed for the existence of peace. In fact, the Panchatantra is not, especially Kakulukiyam, is not a text about trust at all. In fact, the running theme of the Panchatantra is never trust an enemy, for that relationship is never breached. Right. So we have a kind of triad of themes, that is survival, peace, enmity, trust. Right. Of course, the next major theme of Kakulukiyam is kingship. Who is a good king? Right. And the good king is one who has valor, as Cloudy points out, but also who has the wisdom to listen to the judgment of the counselors. Right. So the good king is marked by his preference for wise counselors. Right. In fact, there's this episode in a film which I don't know if you've seen. It's called Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Indiana Jones stars one of my favorite film stars. It's called Harrison Ford. And you have in the end, Sean Connery and Ford have sort of gone to a place where they are searching for the Holy Grail, the cup with which Christ had the Last Supper. Right? It's drank from from the cup. The Holy Grail, which apparently has the power to grant eternal life. And they see a large number of cups, silver, golden, wooden, and so on and so forth. And they are asked to choose which is the Holy Grail. So there are two people who choose. One is Harrison Ford and the other is the villain. And the villain chooses the most gorgeous golden cup and dies out of poison. And Harrison Ford chooses the wooden cup because it is the cup of the carpenter, Christ. Christ was a carpenter by profession, if you remember. And the knight who is overseeing this says he chose wisely. So the point is the wise choice, right? And therefore the importance of the counselor is also another cognate theme of the Panchatantra, in the sense that the king and the counselor are, as it were, welded together, valor and wisdom, right? So the Panchatantra is also about, and Kakulukiam is also about the wise king and discerning judgment. There's another theme that you obviously comes with wisdom is folly, right? So you have a number of stories which deal with the folly of the king, for example. You have the folly of foe crusher, and therefore Red Eye flees, and he says a foolish king is a dangerous king for the country. You have the folly of in the bird which shits gold. He says, the bird says, I was a fool, but I see that the king and the counselor are greater fools. So there's this theme of there's the theme of the common folly of the carpenter, whom the wife tricked into believing that she was sleeping around for his benefit. So the Panchatantra talks about folly in general, not only in kingly, in the life of the king, but also in common life, and how folly leads to ruin. There is also the theme of speech, very important. The theme of the crow, which ruins the coronation of the owl and breeds its enmity. Therefore, harsh speech, intemperate speech, needless speech can often cause great hurt and enmity. So speech, correct speech or speaking is an important, words are an important theme in the Panchatantra as well. There's one text, of course, which you realize has a different theme, and that is the theme of the story of the dove, the self-sacrificing dove. And this story is totally about sacrifice rather than survival, right? It is about the sacrifice of the dove, the female dove, the male dove, and also of the hunter. So all three of them, through their sacrifice and compassion, attain, as it were, liberation and moksha. Now, this one tale is an anomaly in the text, because the other tales do not talk about sacrifice rather than survival. They talk about survival rather than sacrifice. So, it's a problem with the Panchatantra. You see, we had talked about how different kinds of authors might have been involved in the making of the Panchatantra, how it sort of grew in its bulk when it traveled from place to place. So one does not know whether the tale of the dove was originally in the Panchatantra or whether this is just an anomaly within the text. So we've run across a large number of themes, right? And I think I've more or less covered all these themes. Of course, with enmity comes the theme of war and duplicity, shrewdness and intelligence. Remember, shrewdness and intelligence are the themes of Kakulukyo. How does one defeat a more powerful enemy? As one suggests or one sees in Kakulukyo, power does not reside in strength, power resides in intelligence. Right? That is what the Kakulukyo also suggests. So let me run through the themes that we have talked about. The first theme is that of Niti, right? Correct living, wise living, rather than moksha. We've talked about the Purusharthas, the existence of Dharma, which is both absolute and relative, of Kama and of Artha. We've talked about self-fashioning, Buddhi, and the fashioning of your own behavior as part of the theme. We've talked about friendship as being one of the most important themes of the text, moderation and normative social existence. We've talked about war and enmity being the theme of Kakulukiyam. We've talked about speech. We have talked about violence, warfare. We've also talked about the ideal king and his necessity for choosing wise counselors. So the Panchatantra, although is thematically designed towards the king, towards the aristocracy, also involves practical wisdom in democratic life as well. And it is in the interplay of these themes that the text, as it were, reaches its fruition. Now, obviously, the next question is, how is this theme expressed? And what is the role of the beast fable and the animals in this context? Now, in our next discussion, we shall take up the issue of the expression of these themes through the animal and the human and the non-human worlds, the interface between man and animals. But that is for the next class. For now, of course, I would like to stop the recording and then invite your questions.